Hey guys, it's Stanley C. from the If Ever You're Listening podcast. I usually do this in front of the artist, but now I'm thinking it makes more sense to do the introduction separate and then we'll transition into the episode. So here is the introduction. I just finished speaking with Ben Sollee. He's a delight. I can't wait for you to hear from him. Um, and to kind of set the scene, here's a little bit about Ben. Ben Sollee is a well-renowned musician, cellist, composer, and activist from Kentucky whose value-first approach to art is inspiring in today's age. Since 2005, Sollee has reinvented cello's place and style in americana and folk music. He's as innovative as he is thoughtful about the kind of music he makes and the artists he chooses to collaborate with. From classical quartets to folk duos and feature film scores, Sollee is a truly free artist. He didn't get here by accident either. He was very intentional along the way. Paramount to his success is his ability to listen, his openness to listen, both to the world around him and the people within it. I found Solely extremely thoughtful and transparent in our conversation. His perspective is one I would love to see more artists adopt as we get ever closer to a fused music industry with machines and AI side by side with people. As an artist who chooses to add human fingerprints in his music from breaths heard and coughs made in the recording, Solely has the perspective necessary for us to bring humanity back to the center of the art. I hope you thoroughly soak in this enriching conversation and look and listen back. Keep listening. Listen back again and again and again a couple times. There's too many gems to count. It's a real treat. All right, on to the episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the If Ever You're Listening podcast. I'm here with the incredible Kentucky's very own Ben Sollee, and I'm here to talk to him about his latest album, Long Haul, which I'm obsessed with, admittedly, as well as his career thus far, and learn more about kind of his mindset when it comes to creating art and how he's gone about that, and many facets of art. So we won't just be talking about music. I also did some digging into the really cool community projects he's been a part of as well. So thank you so much, Ben. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. So without going kind of linear, kind of just start to finish, I thought of it more, I thought of the questions more in buckets. And the first bucket being kind of the start and your first relationship with music. So I'd love to hear about kind of how did music enter your life growing up and what was your relationship with music as a child?
I grew up in a household that was full of music, mostly like R&B soul music. So my dad was an R&B guitar player and my mom sang. Before we kids came along, my mom and dad had makings on doing sort of a Tuck and Patty type tour around the country, doing originals and covers, and they set that ambition down when the kids arrived, but they kept the music alive in our home. And my dad always said that, people, we didn't need to play music, but we were going to have to walk around all the instruments.
Mhm.
And so I picked up guitar at a pretty early age, always sang, was never very good at singing, but I always sang. And then that eventually led to me uh, kind of running into the cello in public schools in this sort of like instrument petting zoo type
Mhm.
situation. And I was just immediately captivated by all the different sounds that the cello could make. Like for whatever reason in my young little brain, I just saw all the potential in this wooden box with strings with a bow. It all clicked. So, as you are probably familiar with cello, it's typically taught through the convention of classical music.
Mhm.
So now I added this whole other like window of learning into my life where I, was studying classical music. And in addition to that, was also spending weekends with my grandfather, who was also a musician. He was an old time musician in East Kentucky. His name was Elvis Henry Cornelius, which is a super boss name. And somewhere in that constellation of R&B, bluegrass, classical jazz soul stew that I grew up in, um, I had some formative ideas about the kind of music that I wanted to make and how I wanted my music to be used in the world.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Ben. And I think to kind of color the rest of what you end up doing with the cello is this gumbo of different influences and genre fusions, which I find really cool. When you were starting to play and practice, was there a teacher or was it your father or grandfather or family members? Where did this kind of inclination or proclivity towards anti-conformity or kind of creating your own style um, with the cello come from? Was it always there, or was it something that kind of developed over time?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I've reflected back on that, trying to see if there was some, particularly pivotal moment. But there wasn't. I was just a really curious, exuberant young kid, and I loved doing it all. I loved not only playing music, but dancing. I did ballet for a while, and I was also a competing gymnast and in the choir and all these different things. I just was into it all. And so, because of being that sort of generalist approach, I never really accepted the boundaries on the cello. Um, and so, as time went on, that created more and more of a story, a narrative that I lived into of not necessarily being a renegade cellist or anything innovative. Sorry about the dings. Uh, but just being a musician that happened to play cello. And I think I was lucky enough to have some teachers that just accepted and acknowledged that that was going to be my path, as opposed to being a classical orchestral cellist. And that wasn't across the board. I did have some teachers that were really, very assertive in their approach that the cello was to be played a certain way, and this was the particular quote unquote legitimate music that was to be played on the cello. And I just didn't give a damn. I just didn't care. So I don't know where that nonconformist idea came in. I can say for sure that it wasn't me trying to be nonconformist. It's just I just never I just heard all the sounds on the cello. Like from the get-go. It was just a different instrument. I've reflected that because I went to a small school in Lexington where I was in a very small group of students that had chosen to be in the orchestra, and that group, happened to only have one cellist, me. And because we rehearsed, twice a week in the utility closet, I just didn't have, there wasn't someone sitting next to me correcting me, saying, no, 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 don't make that sound that way or hold your bow this way. Um, I did have some teachers, one cellist in particular, Michael Fitzpatrick, who was, very open. He's this sort of cosmic type cellist. He was very open. Like his main manual for teaching me cello was Zen and the Art of Guitar Playing. Like how you hold your instrument, how you like how to be present with the instrument. Um, but yeah, other than that, it was just me being who I am, I guess.
Just you being who you are, but making that kind of point to do it anyway, I find still profound because a lot of artists, they have their sound, but then they easily get dragged into whatever's popular or whatever is hip or whatever their friends are influencing them with or whatever your for artists, whatever your fans are telling you to do. And something I've heard you say before, or I've read, I should say, is being intentional with your art and whether that's with the cause or with the music you make. And so I love to
Right.
hear kind of the flip side of anti-conformity, pro intentionality. How is being intentional kind of maybe early on in your career shaped how you became who you are today, as well as how did you sustain it over time? I think is my biggest question, which I haven't been able to find, and I would love to hear more about.
That's a very big question. So from a very young age, I wanted to use my music to bring people together. It was always, pop-up shows and open mics at coffee shops. It was being in the the community musicals and so on. So I liked the idea of music being something that was a social activity. I
Mhm.
was I was never and still am not the sort of like hold up in your studio to make your masterpiece kind of musician.
Mhm.
Um, honestly, I just don't create that way. I create generally um, externally with other musicians and creatives, and usually that's an emergent process, right? It's not, here's the charts, let's play it down. You can do a little bit of your thing if you want. It's much more like hey, here's a concept, here's a prompt, here's an idea, and let's see where it grows. Let's jam on it. And I've only recently learned that language of emergent strategy from Adrian Murray Brown.
Mhm.
But it's something that I think I intuitively did a lot growing up. Um, and so as a sprout of this idea of bringing people together and being social with music, I think it was very intuitive to me to use music around social and environmental activism. So really trying to grow affection around different issues by using songs and performance spaces and even taking the music out to those spaces to have them share in the music making process was a way of connecting people to the issues, but more importantly, growing affection of those issues. Why, whether that was mountaintop removal, strip mining, or it was access to clean water, or it was um, dealing with child poverty in my hometown, or it was just access to education at all. And nowadays, it's much more around livability infrastructure and food and quality of life and well-being, kind of public health oriented stuff, and dealing with loneliness through bringing people together in music, right?
Mhm.
That has just always been something that's been very, very intuitive to me. And so, um, in other kind of walks of life outside of music and the arts, that would be called a values first approach,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
So, I do some work in the nonprofit space, and this is often the language that gets used. And in that values-based approach, I found myself getting called to do more and different gigs.
Mhm.
So not just performance, but collaboration on events, and not just collaboration on events, but creating music for documentaries, which eventually led to creating music for TV and feature-length films. And it's not because I had any specific training as a composer in film or that I had any specific training in writing for dance, but that my values aligned with those other creatives.
Mhm.
And I just followed those opportunities as they presented themselves. So, in that way, which I now have come to understand is much more of like a middle way type approach to use Zen language, right? So that middle way that I've just always sought out. And through that, it's created a wonderful network of creatives and activists and, just people doing good in the community, good people doing good things. And
Good
that's
people
how I've
do.
sustained it. I've
Yeah.
sustained it through just long-term relationships.
No, and I think that's what magnetized me to your work, not just the music, but also when I started reading into like what you do outside of music, it connected to kind of what I'm trying to do with If Ever You're Listening. So it's a blog that's also a podcast, it's also a newsletter that focuses on kind of connecting people of different music tastes, people of different cultural backgrounds, and kind of trying to mitigate some of the tensions because music is becoming more global, we're becoming more interconnected, but there's also these factions that kind of stay antagonistic to each other, whether that's stan culture or whether that's um, going to concerts and you're just homogenous. It's a very homogenous concert, which could be fine, but it could also be, it doesn't have to be that way because maybe other people just aren't familiar with the songs and the music. And so when I dug more into your work and more into this intentionality, this value driven work, I was inspired by which is kind of leading to my next question, the collaborations that you do. And
Mhm.
so I noticed because I was listening to the albums and I was like, okay, great, great, great. And then I noticed, wait, a lot of these are collab albums. I was like, wait, who are all these extra people? And then I started to listen to your music in two separate, three, it's really more than two separate buckets, but two buckets was solo projects and collab projects. And so my question for you, Ben, is how do you seek, or does the collaboration seek you? How do you choose who to collaborate with? Whether that's for a project or a collective of musicians, as well as for films and kind of extra musical projects.
Yeah. Mm. Well, typically I work with people that I just resonate with for whatever reason. Sometimes it's very intuitive, like, hey, I like playing music with you. Let's play music. Other times it is more like thoughtful, like, hey, we're from the same place. We're from a similar place on Earth, and we're trying to do similar things. Let's team up. Um, But the most successful collaborations are certainly the ones where I don't know why. They're
Mm-hmm.
just resonant. And one of those was my longtime musical brother collaborator, Jordan Ellis, who I worked with. I mean, we met back in All-State Jazz Band in high school, but we really worked in earnest together from 2009 until his passing last year. And I it was a great teaching moment for me, uh, because I realized how much of a keystone he was in my creative process. Just having someone who was musically patient, but also very creative, um, that would just sit and jam with me as I externally worked out my ideas. And I find that's the folks that I work best with, that are, have incredibly broad skill set on their instruments. They can play everything from, Appalachian to West African music and all the things that intertwine those. Um, and they have an interest and passion in that connective tissue of music. So, I think in short, you could say that I like working with people who are good listeners. Um, I typically, the relationships and collaborations that are shortest lived are with the people who have the strongest ideas. Um, and the ones that have lasted so long and borne a lot of fruit are the folks who are really good listeners.
Mm. No, that's fascinating. That's fascinating, especially because it's not this idea of sticking basically with your gut, and sticking with what is a better kind of relationship that you're naturally building with somebody, rather than I think this person also thinks this, so it's magically going to work. It's you're kind of letting it happen more organically than um, some who try to kind of force it to happen. You're not forcing it to happen. But you mentioned a lot about kind of people that are open to trying different sounds and making music in different genres, and that leads me to kind of long haul. Because I was listening to it right before this. I was worried you were gonna come in and then I was still gonna be hearing it, so I had to like cut it off at like 3:59. Um, I was stuck, I think, on Misty Mile. Yes, Misty Miles. But I was kind of still impressed with the variety of different sounds on one project. And from project to project, obviously there's different sounds. But what particularly kind of what keeps me in long haul so much is I'm hearing great country, I'm hearing great Americana, I'm even hearing, I want to say reggae, West African music. And so I just want to hear from you kind of I can't even imagine what the recording process must have been for that. I'm like dreaming of what it could be, but how did you, I guess, record the project? What inspired you? And to the point about collaborations, how were the collaborations for that project?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for listening so much and hearing all of those influences and details. Because, sure, this album references music from the American South, but it also wanders further into the global South. Um, and there's a ton of connective tissue across all of that music. I think the process began through my health journey, recovering from long haul COVID, which was about a year and a half process of trying to heal and renegotiate my relationship with my body and my food and all this different stuff. And through that, feeling like very connected to the world and thinking about, okay, what were the times that were like truly transcendent, the times where I really felt like that dissolution of ego and just really connected to the world. And and really following that resonance, right? Whether that was, in a specific place in the world or doing a specific activity. Um, and so knowing that those experiences often happened by chance, they were not planned, they were not uh, curated in any way. They were just moments that just happened out there and be like, okay, well, I'm not going to find these by looking for them. So I have to let them emerge. And so I gave myself kind of two permission, mandates, whatever you want to call them. Like I gave myself permission for the first time to follow the muse.
Mm.
And um, wherever wherever the resonance led me, I trusted it and gave myself permission to do that. Whether that was, classic Muscle Shoals vibes, or that was incorporating, Polynesian influences, or like even, there's quite a few songs on the record that bring in influences from Madagascar, like because that's such a beautiful, special place in the world where you had this sort of organic, oceanic music kind of colliding with West African influences on this island that was isolated for a while, right? So you had a natural geographic experiment in what these sounds could do together. So you get West African rhythm mixing with Polynesian flute playing, and like that's just one thing, like thread that I pulled on from this record because I just loved that playing, and I just trusted that if I, if I loved it authentically and I referenced it authentically, that it would work in the music. And the second thing that I gave myself permission to do was to show our fingerprints
Mm.
in an age where music is becoming, well, not just music, but arts, creativity is becoming more automated and generative with technology. It's the first time ever that we really have a sort of alien intelligence
Mhm.
that is able to be creative and make new work. People might argue that it's derivative, but I'm not sure at this point some of these large language models are any more or less derivative than, 99.9% of the humans on this planet.
Yep.
Um, so with those two things, I I followed this process of sort of what I described as like a cultivating process of ideas, right? Where I would get a group of musicians together. I would bring what I called seeds. So like little musical ideas, not demos, but like little sketches. And then we would jam on those and sprout them. Some of them would sprout, some of them wouldn't take.
Mm.
Right. And so then I'd bring that back into the studio, chop up the rehearsal recordings, put them together, and bring those sprouts, transplant them into another jam session, right? So I'd bring those in, and then we would cultivate those, and some of those ideas would grow, and some of them would not.
Mm.
And so through that process, we took about 50 seeds and created about, I would say, 25 or so sprouts. And then those sprouts developed into actual demos. So like actual, plantable plants of about 20 demos. And then that created 15 songs that we recorded, 10 of which ended up on this record.
Wow. Very cool.
So a very, very emergent process, but it began again that with that feeling of connectivity and trusting the resonance, giving myself permission to um, pursue and embrace that resonance, and then also really devoting myself to showing our fingerprints. So
Mm.
this is very human-made music. The choice of the instrumentation, the hand percussion versus, regular drums that could be closer and more immersive. Um, the a lot of the woodwinds where you can hear the breath, the way we recorded the strings, the choirs on this record. It's the first time I've really used choirs on a record.
Mhm.
All of that was in keeping with that idea of showing our fingerprints.
Okay. I was going to ask about what do you mean by fingerprints, but you just that's a really good point. And I've heard I even wrote the song down. This is kind of cool. Towards the bottom, just older songs I've enjoyed of yours. Of um is it the guitar man and the singing girl? I want to say
Oh,
that.
wow, yeah, you dug deep. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I went all the way back. I tried to find the first solo album, and there was debates on like when you really started because there's like a collab album. Sorry, but to go to my point is the Guitar Man and the Singing Girl. Yeah, I have a note on that. It's like you get emotional towards the end of the story, and
Mhm.
you even like hear your voice breaking, and that type of fingerprint is something I wanted to point out to what you're talking about right now. So
Right.
that I love that kind of aspect of the music, and it's really profound that you did incorporate that into this on purpose because of how non-human a lot of art now is becoming. And so I guess then my question for you is, what do you think the role of the artist is now with the current insertion of non-human art being made, as well as because you're an independent artist, and right now there's a big wave of artists on labels trying to be independent. So for an artist who was already independent before it was quote unquote popular, as well as as well as a somebody who puts their fingerprint in the music before before even this project, what do you see as the role of artists nowadays?
Hmm. That is a good question. I've not been asked that question yet in the context of today. Um, I mean, the role of artists first and foremost is to listen, or if your discipline is visual, to really look, to give attention to this world. That is something that the large language models that are they're not embodied in any way. So it is our job, and I would argue the job of all these humans on this planet to really listen and be present for the beauty that's there. And then from that, I think our job is to really again go back to that idea of affection, to really grow affection. And I don't mean necessarily love or intimate or like physical affection. I mean like intimate knowledge of something,
Mm,
experience with that. So often that means writing from your own life experience, from the very personal and totally authentic place that is you and can be very, very vulnerable to do. It doesn't have to be like exploitative of your life or your loved ones' lives, right? I try to always honor those boundaries in my art making, but at the same time, there's something unique about your perspective as a human living with a body on this planet right now that no one else has experienced that you can share. And through that sharing and that sort of full spectrum experience, we begin to build those bridges in culture. And that's not a small thing. I mean, we live in an age where there's so much isolation and loneliness and lack of belonging. And you know, much of that can be accounted for by how much we've changed the way that we communicate, which is to say how we share culture. And I think by creating art that's authentic from the place that you are and the life that you've lived, you are creating culture. And through that in a community with collaboration and this, especially this emergent type process, you can get a cultural coherence. And that is the fabric that ties societies together. And that is being challenged in the biggest way I think that humans have ever faced this, outside of like religions and tribal customs, right? Like we actually have, again, an alien intelligence that is intimately weaving into our lives. I mean, it's making choices for what we see, what we buy, what we eat, who we choose as our partners, right? Like it's offering up algorithmic options for us. And we don't necessarily look behind the curtain of the algorithm and be like, well, what didn't you offer? What did you cut out? You know, we're just choosing from what is on the menu in front of us. Um, and that is not a small thing. That's a big deal because we experience our world through our cultures. And so it's the role of the artist to truly and authentically observe, give attention to, and express what's going on in the world.
Mm.
And in a way that these large language models and other kind of generative tools like, you know, shoot, what's the big music one I was playing with the other day? Suma, I think is what it's called.
Tuma.
Yeah. You know, it's making amazing stuff. You can give it a prompt and it will just generate a really cool piece of music,
It is
you know, and
outstanding.
happy to just do it. It's happy to just do it. And then you add visuals to that, and suddenly you've got, you know, something that was created with nothing more than like a prompt.
Mhm.
And it can be a very unthoughtful prompt in that way. So I embracing a lot of these new tools, but at the same time realizing that maybe for the first time that there is something about being an artist that is separate from all of this sort of more industrialized work that we do of uh, the 3 minute song and the recording of it and the distribution of it and the promotion of it and all that other things that we do as artists that takes up frankly the majority of our time outside of the art making. Um, that stuff is that's the industrial side. That's the stuff that the bots can be quite good at. So the hope is that we can spend more time making the art, but we
Mm.
have to really guard and protect our attention to do that because the whole economy is based around attention. And so we have to really protect that.
100%. And that's like, I want to like put that in like a book somewhere. That was a really, and thank you for sharing that. I'll be listening to that in perpetuity. For the part you mentioned about kind of sharing your human experience and the importance of being thoughtful about kind of what you share and also having boundaries, but also being very intentional about sharing human experiences, something kind of bringing us to modern times, very modern times, is you're on tour right now. And what I really like about it is that you at least from what I've seen online is that you're bringing your daughters with you and you're having
Yeah.
your kids be a part of it. And that feels so human. It feels so real. It feels so natural that I wanted to kind of highlight that. And I was curious how are you seeing now tour through their eyes, or has tour changed for you through maybe their perspective?
So I have kind of two eras in my family. My son, who's 16, was born in like kind of the prime of my touring. I was touring as a sideman with Abigail Washburn and Bela Fleck as the Sparrow Quartet, and just beginning to think about a solo career. And he kind of grew up with a dad traveling on and off the road, and he experienced a lot of the road. I mean, he's been to, you know, so many countries and all, certainly all over this country, most states in the United States. So very privileged in that way to have seen so much as such a young feller. Um, but then in 2017-ish, I came off the road. I was a little burned out. I realized in reflection, but I also just had this extreme urge to localize. You know, I felt like I'd spread myself very thin around the country and world as a touring artist and activist. And it didn't feel like my work was firmly rooted in the ground. And so I wanted to do that work locally here in Kentucky, especially in Louisville. And so did a lot of really cool work with nonprofits and started into my film scoring age of life. Um, and also grew my family by two kids. So my daughters are 6 and 4. So 10 years spacing between these two eras of my son at 16 and then at 6 and 4. And because of when they were born, what I was doing, and the great pause, aka the pandemic, uh, they didn't know me as a touring artist.
Okay.
Frankly, they didn't even really know me as a musician
Interesting.
because it just, for whatever reason, it wasn't, they didn't come see me at the few shows that I did play.
Got it.
And so this recent tour where I was touring with the Louisville Orchestra performing some of my music and other shows, it was kind of their first time really seeing what Daddy does on the road.
Cool.
And it was, I think it was a little startling to them because they didn't have a full picture of it. But it was also very exciting to them because they got to go lots of different places, eat lots of different things, visit with all kinds of different people. And, kids are the best teachers in terms of being present
Hmm.
because they weren't caught up with where they weren't. They were so excited to be where they were.
Hmm.
And sure, there were times when they're like, when are we going to get home? But then they'd get totally captivated by what was happening in front of them, whether it was a person they were meeting or an animal or a piece of art they were making, um, just totally captivated. So, in many ways, they're teaching me how to be most present on the road, which I appreciate.
That's so precious. That's so precious. Yes, apologies. I forgot to mention your son. But thank you for answering kind of the difference in how they experience you as an artist, as a musician. It is crazy because I imagine for you, you're like, I'm always an artist, I'm always a musician, but people, depending on where they see you in your life, whether that's your kids, your friends, your family, you're like a different person to everybody. And that's fascinating because I kind of to a very small extent relate because like I do this with the music and then I have like a full-time job where I do completely different thing like university.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And they're like, what do you mean you talk to musicians? And I was like, I love this. This is so much fun. um Okay, so thank you for sharing that. I have a question about the Louisville Orchestra. So you were ahead of me there. I wanted to hear your experience with that. You had three shows, I believe, in Louisville, with the orchestra, and you were playing music from long haul, if I got that correctly.
And I wish we didn't have time to chart it all out, but
Uh,
it was a little in-state tour that the Louisville Orchestra does called the In Harmony Tour. And so we played in these, more rural towns. And you know, I have a degree in classical music, so I'm very familiar with the orchestral, literature and life, but I just never wanted necessarily to be a part of it. I really enjoyed all the other the broad collaboration and kind of folk. I liked the social structure of folk music much more than playing in this more rigid orchestral world. But at the same time, gosh, it's infectious to play with an orchestra. Just all those players doing like coordinating together, like they're reading from these parts to make something greater than any one individual could make. Uh, they're coordinating their bowing, so they're coordinating motion, they're coordinating breath even at the same time. It is a beautiful thing to watch. And they're doing it from all sorts of different, social backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. It's really cool. And they do it at a super high level. So it's kind of like the analogy I have is I spend a lot of time, traveling, playing in rock clubs. So I like, riding in a pickup truck, right? It's kind of like a little rigid, oh, sorry, like the steering's a little sloppy and like you never quite know what you're going to get on these roads. But then you go sit with an orchestra and it's like in a really nice sports car. And it's
mm,
like you can feel the connection to the road. Under that baton, it's real nice. So I just feel totally lucky that I can bounce in between these musical worlds so much, right? I can work with a DJ one day and then work with an African drummer on a sound score the next, and then stand in front of an orchestra and be able to speak that language
mm,
of, articulations. Um, it's nice, and it all just comes down to listening.
Mm, I should title this Listen, just listen. Um,
Yeah, no, I have a song called "Learn to Listen." That
oh,
is probably one of my.
on which project?
It's on the Steeples EPs, and
Got it. Yep. Yep.
it is probably my
Or
best
two.
song. When I play that live, it's like a mantra. Because
Learn to.
we make a lot of musicians, we make a lot of noise as musicians, but it's so important to listen, listen,
I love.
listen.
I have to listen to those EPs now. I think those because they're like short, right? They're like three songs. I think I
Right.
was like, I have to focus on the albums. I'm not going to listen to the EP. So I knew about them, but I haven't heard them. So now I'm really very curious about that. Okay. Well, so we're nearing the end of my questions. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. So I call these the if ever you're listening questions. So either these are not artist specific. We're past the artist specific questions about your career, your music, your experience. And these are questions that I ask anybody who I speak with. They're general questions, but everybody's unique. So you all give me unique answers, and I'm very curious about your answers to these questions. The first one is kind of just a fun question about lately, maybe September, maybe this week, maybe on your walk over here. What have you been listening to these days? What are some maybe artists or albums that have really struck your fancy?
Right. Um, Gosh, my son has really great tastes in music, and
Mhm.
so he's been introducing me to a lot of different artists. Um, one of those is Lawrence and also Sammy Ray and Friends.
Mhm.
Love that stuff. Love those great singers. Um, Left to my own devices, I listen to a lot of stories and nature recordings.
Very cool.
Uh, you know, the incredible range of sound that nature produces. I have yet to get tired of marveling.
Mhm.
I mean, it just everything from like kind of the geophonic sound of winds and shifting rocks and waves to the biophony of all these incredible animals that are making sounds that we can't even hear, but we can feel,
Mhm.
right? That's influencing it, you know. Um, to of course, the sounds that humans make unintentionally, right? When they're just going about their lives. Um, I know just nature recordings are big ones. I'm a big fan of Gordon Hempton, who does all this, you know, work traveling around recording and kind of looking for the quiet places on the planet where there's not all this kind of anthrophony of sound, right? You just where you can really just listen to the earth being the earth.
Mhm.
Hmm.
No, that sounds very beautiful and very magnificent. I'm very curious. I want to hear those. I did hear something you made that was based in nature. The groundwater sonification sculptures, I want to say. Where you made it. Well, I'll let you describe it. Kind of what was that project and how did you I actually don't understand how you did it. I read it, but I was like, how does he take so can you maybe go short
Yeah,
description?
well, so this was a interactive sculpture in Lexington, Kentucky called Livestream. Uh, and the intention behind the structure, the sculpture experience was to connect people with groundwater, which is this unseen force, aka resource. I don't like using that word about water, but it's this thing that we all need that's flowing under our feet, but we're not really connected to it. And so oftentimes it gets assigned a zero. And we wanted to connect people with that. So we created this kind of large uh, pipe structure, think Mario Brothers,
Mhm.
that had interactive spaces. And we took groundwater data from previous years and, uh, you know, measured things like turbidity and conductivity, and these sorts of metrics, plot them out on a table, and then created what would amount into sort of a digital piano scroll
Mhm.
where the numbers of data would generate kind of a MIDI score that would play these different sounds. And then we also incorporated an interactive element with LiDAR where the kids or adults could kind of interact with those sounds and make them louder or more intense.
Yeah. Very cool. I need to go to Louisville, honestly, because that sounds, is it still there? Or was it like
As
a,
far as I know, it's still in Lexington and the
okay,
park. I haven't gone to see it in a while.
got
Uh,
it. Lexington.
it would be expensive to remove because it's a big sculpture.
Fair, fair, fair. That's incredible. Amazing. My next question is, which song of yours do you think is the most underrated or underappreciated, and why?
Hmm. I think the song of mine that might be most underappreciated or just not heard is the song. It might be the Maestro.
Hmm,
I think it's the last song on my Half Made Man record.
that's on my list. That's on.
And it's a song that deals with, you know, identity, the power of music, time, that does so through this character, this elderly conductor who, in his mind is just like breaking down all of these walls with music. And experiencing love for the first time again and again and again. And we find that by the end of the song, he's just on an empty stage conducting. And I've actually performed that with an orchestra before, where we slowly took the musicians away and left the conductor on stage conducting to silence for about 2 minutes. It was incredibly powerful because that is it.
Mhm.
The music is not coming out of the instruments. The music is not even necessarily in the score. That's sitting on top of the music of life,
Mhm.
the embodied experience of living, the environment that we put ourselves in, that we have no control over the sounds that emerge and then move on without us. So I think that song gets over overlooked, skipped because A, it's at the end of a record, and B, it's a slow burn. It's a
Yep.
slow burn, but it's a pretty thing.
It's a gorgeous. So I'm not even pretending. I could screenshot this to you after our call. It's on my short list of my favorite Vince Sollee songs, The Maestro. I promise.
Yeah.
It's a gorgeous song. So I'm so glad. I need to. Is there a recording of that presentation of the live version with the
Like a lot of things with orchestras, recordings exist, but
not like
they're not available because
yeah,
that would cost a lot of extra money.
fair, 100% fair. Beautiful. Okay. Two more questions. And this is a one I'm really curious what you would have to say. If you could change anything about the music industry, what would it be and why?
About the music industry.
As someone who's seen the music industry in so many of its phases, kind of maybe at its current stage, is there something it needs to go back to, or maybe something it needs to do moving forward?
Mm, mm. I mean, I guess I'm a practicalist when it comes down to it because I mean I can't change the way it is. I can't change how music has been recorded music has been devalued by streaming technology and new production tools that are loop-based music that make it easy to recycle and recycle and recycle. And that creates sort of a culture loop that gets us stuck, and it makes it hard to build new culture when we're um, always nostalgic for the music that's past, and that's kind of being used as like a hack to get us to listen. Um, but I can say with a lot of certainty going forward, I feel that the pendulum has shifted and will continue to move towards um, high touch, human made sound.
Mhm.
Um, I think that as we do get more and more generative technology, and as it becomes very easy for you to connect your heart rate to whatever streaming service, and it can generate workout music for you or generate cooking music or whatever, right? Um, People can have more personalized experiences, which also is to say more isolated experiences. I think that to contrast that, the human makers of music will need to change the way that they approach recording and performance so that it is very tactile, textured, breathy, touchy, like um
Oh
and
yeah.
then we'll get better at, faking that, just like the latest kind of language models are able to speak with breath and pauses and giggles, right? It's a pantomime, it's a sleight of hand, but it's good, you know?
Hmm.
And so it's a good challenge for us to think about, okay, well, what's the truly human part of it? And this might mean some, we tap on the roots of some of these other cultural things like Korean pansori singing, right? Like that embodies all of this incredible like screaming and wailing and like that maybe that's music that somehow trends more up. Necessarily see that happening, but maybe it's just more, you know, tactile music. And then there's like really investing in your live performance experience as a musician,
Yeah.
right? Like it is so tempting to be like, well, I could just take me and a drummer out and some tracks, right? And then we can just play along to the tracks.
Yeah.
Crowd don't care. Like, but you're gonna get lonely.
Yep.
Crowd cares about that because they want to be moved. They
Hmm.
want to feel you feeling. And if you get bored and are unsurprised by the music that you are making, I can guarantee you
They'll know.
the audience will be bored and unsurprised by the music that you're making. And they're there to be surprised, to be captivated. You gotta you that has to begin with you as a musician. And for me, that is playing music with other musicians. It's more expensive. It's a lot more logistics, but it is totally worth it.
Mm. Did you find, thank you for sharing that. Did you find when you, for the listener, at one point, and I don't know if you're still doing this, Ben, but you toured on a bike, not a truck, not a trailer, not a car, a bike, and you might imagine how does he do this with a cello? Watch, there's videos, there's great interviews where you discuss this at length, but based on the answer you just gave me, was that something that helped you keep everything kind of fresh and new and personally exciting because you had this experience? I love that one story where you talk about the boy in the community that hopped on the bike with you, and then you kept going, and then he's like, I have to go home. Building those memories, making it more of a memorable, unique experience. Was that something that kind of helped you make the live performances more unique and individual versus you're kind of copy and cut pasting every night?
Or as my experience being on the road, it was just much more present.
Mm,
Um, it was more time in places than in between them. And um, it goes back to that attention thing. Like what you pay attention to grows. And, I find myself often captivated by, the shiny casino of technology right now.
mhm.
And then I realized, like, shit, like this is my one ride on this planet. Come on, like, pay attention, pay attention. So I will return to the bicycle tours when my kids are a little bit older. Right now, I have to be more thoughtful, more economical about it because they are twice the time for half the money. The bicycle, right? It takes twice as much time, and you're just not going to make as much money playing these little small venues. But it's incredibly rewarding. The experiences, I just couldn't trade those. And now that some of the people that did those bicycle tours with me are not on this planet anymore, they're even more of a treasure, right? And I'm so glad that I was there and really present for them. Like we pedaled every freaking mile, like
So cool.
it was about 5,000 plus miles over 5 years. Mhm.
Unbelievable, honestly. Unbelievable, but inspiring. And I hope this conversation, for you, for context for Ben, a lot of my listeners or readers, they're also musicians. They're also, so I want this to be inspiring for them. That's why I'm asking kind of artist specific. I want the artist to almost be freed through this conversation, or be liberated, or feel a sense of themselves, and to be present. I feel exceptionally present right now. My
Give
last
your,
question.
yeah,
Sorry.
give yourself for those listening, give yourself permission to to find the resonance and then just trust it. Like it doesn't have to be something that's a part of your immediate story for you to make art with it. Like there is a reason that it feels interesting, engaging, surprising, and right. You just have to trust that. It might not be in your family's recent history that you feel connected to the music of Basque country, Spain, but that doesn't mean you can't use it in your art because you love it. At the end of the day, like wherever you start your story has a big impact on what your story is. And let the art reveal things about your story that other people didn't tell you.
A wonderful piece of advice, and that leads to my final question on what is the best piece of advice about in your life, in your career, that you've been steward with up to this point.
The best piece of advice that I have received is sort of a came in the way of like condensation from just living around, you know, people who care for beauty and the planet. Um, and it's this sort of non-dual understanding that one of the most radical things you can do is to care for yourself, not as an individual in some optimized way with, tracking your macros and, you know, optimizing your health. No, as an aspect of nature, not a human, but as an aspect of nature, and trusting that the things that are happening on this planet are nature expressing something through us. And if you care about nature, you should begin by caring about yourself and be a steward of this body that we have. If you care about social justice, begin by not exploiting yourself, right? Take a cue from the nap ministry and rest in resistance. If you care about, um, you know, poverty, right? Like make sure that you are not impoverishing yourself by like just giving your attention away to everything, right? Just like really begin that story like with caring for yourself. Because in doing that, you will magnetically bring people to the table of caring about their communities and about their little piece of nature that they are stewards over. That is the most lasting and sustainable change that I have experienced in the world. And it makes for a beautiful experience for the art that you make and for the art that's already here on this planet. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ben, for the thoughtfulness, for being present, and for the illuminating kind of insights you're sharing. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you again for coming to the If Ever Listening podcast. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, and I love that your mission is listening. That's where it all begins. All right,
Take,
thank you, brother. Take care.
bye.